The Halloween Night Stalker. The night had an edge to it, one of those sharp, brittle edges that made everything feel too still, too quiet. Halloween in our town always had that weight in the air, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something bad to happen. They said it was because of the Night Stalker. Every year the stories would start circulating again, louder as the leaves turned orange and the air grew colder. Parents whispered warnings to their children, told them not to stay out too late. "Don't go wandering past midnight," they'd say. "You never know who or what might be waiting in the dark." And every year, a group of kids thought they were above it all, thought it was just some made-up horror to keep them scared and obedient. This year it was us. We were the ones who thought we could laugh in the face of fear. The dare was simple. Stay out past midnight on Halloween, roam the empty streets, and prove the Night Stalker wasn't real. It seemed easy enough. We'd all heard the stories, how the stalker was a masked figure who hunted anyone foolish enough to tempt fate after the clock struck 12. He'd wait in the shadows, they said, a flash of cold steel in his hand, and then there'd be blood. Always blood. But stories were just stories, right? The air was colder than it should have been for late October, cutting through our jackets as we made our way through the town square. The streets were nearly deserted by 11 p.m. A few stragglers hurrying home, clutching their coats tight around them, heads down, like they could sense something in the air too. The street lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to follow us no matter how fast we walked. "Midnight," one of us said, voice a little too loud, a little too eager. "We just gotta make it till then." I didn't say anything, but something about the way the shadows stretched unnaturally long on the pavement made me glance over my shoulder. Empty. Just the wind, I told myself, as it rustled the leaves across the street. Still, there was something about the silence that seemed off. We reached the edge of town, where the old train station stood, abandoned and crumbling, like a tombstone for the dead industry that once kept this place alive. It was always darker here, the lights dimming just as you crossed the tracks. That was the spot, the place where, according to legend, the Night Stalker claimed most of his victims. The silence here was suffocating, thick, as if the air itself had turned to ash. And then, the first sound broke it, a low scraping, like metal against concrete. We all froze. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to go home, to forget the dare and leave this cursed place behind. But pride's a funny thing. It'll keep you standing in the face of every alarm going off in your head, just because you don't want to be the one who chickens out. "It's just the wind," someone said, but their voice shook. Another sound, closer this time, a scraping, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through the darkness. My eyes darted to the shadows around us, trying to see past the flickering streetlights. There was nothing there, no one there. Just empty streets and the distant hum of a power line. But we weren't alone. We all knew it. We could feel it, in the way the air seemed to thicken, in the way the hairs stood up on the backs of our necks. The scraping sound stopped. And then, in the suffocating silence that followed, there was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud, too hollow in the empty street. No answer. Just more footsteps, coming closer, and then a shadow moved, just out of the corner of my eye, slinking through the gaps in the streetlights. I turned toward it, heart hammering in my throat. The shadow stretched impossibly long, growing taller, until it wasn't a shadow anymore. It was a figure, a man. He stood at the far end of the street, barely more than a silhouette in the faint light. But there was something wrong with the way he moved, slow and stiff, like a marionette being dragged along by invisible strings. And then, in one swift, horrifying movement, he was closer. Too close. A mask covered his face, featureless except for a twisted, grotesque grin carved into it. His hand hung at his side, gripping something long, metallic, and glinting in the weak light. A scream died in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The others backed away slowly, too stunned to react, too horrified to look away. The figure took another step forward, dragging something heavy behind him, something wet, something that left a thick, dark smear on the pavement. And then he stopped, just outside the circle of light, close enough for us to see the blood dripping from the edge of his blade. Midnight was close. We just had to make it a few more minutes, but as the clock in the distance began to toll, each chime felt like a nail being driven into a coffin. Ours. When the 12th chime rang, the street light above us flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, he was gone. But the scraping sound started again, closer this time, so much closer. The scraping noise was louder now, grating against the pavement like nails on a chalkboard. It was the kind of sound that crawled up your spine and settled deep in your bones, making every muscle in your body scream at you to run. But none of us moved. We couldn't. We stood frozen in place, staring at the empty spot where the figure had just been. The flickering streetlight above us cast broken shadows, making the world feel fractured, like reality itself had slipped out of focus. I kept waiting for one of us to say something, to crack a joke, to brush it all off like we always did when things got too real. But there was no joke to be made. No words could undo what we had just seen. The scraping continued, closer still, until it sounded like it was right behind us. The others slowly turned to look, but I couldn't. My legs were trembling, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. It was like the world had gone mute, except for that unbearable sound. Then the footsteps came again, slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their feet through a pool of thick mud. I swallowed hard and forced myself to turn, to face whatever was creeping up on us from the shadows. There he was, standing barely 10 feet away now. The mask, with that grotesque smile, seemed to glisten under the flickering light, as though it were wet with something dark. His eyes, no, not eyes, just empty black holes where they should have been, stared straight at me. I felt my stomach twist into knots, and bile rose in my throat. "Run," one of us whispered, but none of us did. His head tilted, slow and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. The blade in his hand dragged along the ground, making that horrific scraping noise again, leaving a smear of blood behind it. "Run!" The whisper turned into a shout, but it wasn't my voice. It was hers. She bolted first, her feet slamming against the pavement as she sprinted down the empty street. Her breath came in ragged gasps, echoing in the night, and for a moment, I thought she'd make it. I thought maybe, just maybe, we could all get out of this alive. But the figure moved faster than I could have imagined. He didn't run. He didn't have to. One moment he was standing still. The next he was beside her, his hand shooting out like a snake striking its prey. The blade flashed under the streetlight, and there was a sickening wet thud as it connected with her side. She screamed, a sound that pierced the night and made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a scream of pain. It was terror, raw and primal, the kind that made you realize you were about to die. The rest of us took off then, adrenaline pumping through our veins as we sprinted down the street. My legs felt like jelly, every muscle burning with effort as I pushed myself harder and harder. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I could hear was the sound of my own footsteps, and behind them, the relentless scraping of that damn blade. "Keep going," someone shouted. "Don't stop!" But no matter how fast we ran, no matter how hard we pushed, the sound of the blade followed us, closer, always closer. The town had turned into a maze of empty streets and dark alleys, all of them blending together as we ran, gasping for air, our hearts pounding in our chests like they might explode at any second. I glanced over my shoulder, and for a brief moment I saw him again. The mask, the twisted smile, the blade dripping with fresh blood. He was always just there, always one step behind us, like he was playing a game. We turned a corner and ducked into an alley, desperate for a place to hide, to catch our breath, to think of a way out. But there was no way out. We all knew it. The walls felt like they were closing in, the shadows pressing against us from every side. "We can't keep running," I panted, barely able to get the words out. "He's too fast." Someone else nodded, their face pale with fear. "We have to split up. He can't follow all of us." "Are you insane?" Another voice hissed. "We stick together. We have a better chance that way." But deep down, we all knew the truth. Together or apart, it didn't matter. He'd catch us. It was only a matter of time. The alley stretched out before us, long and narrow, with no exits in sight. The only light came from a single flickering bulb overhead, casting eerie shadows along the brick walls. I wiped the sweat from my brow, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of footsteps, our footsteps, echoed back at us. But there was something else, something beneath the sound of our panic. Scrape, drag, scrape, closer, so much closer. A flash of movement from the corner of my eye, and I turned just in time to see him step into the alley, the blade gleaming in the half-light. His mask, with that terrible grin, seemed to glow in the darkness, and his head tilted again, like he was mocking us. We were trapped. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling over the others as we tried to push our way deeper into the alley. But there was no deeper. There was no escape. Then came the laughter, soft at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew, echoing off the walls, filling the space until it felt like it was coming from every direction. It wasn't his laughter. It was familiar. Wrong. I looked around, my heart racing, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. But before I could make sense of it, the scraping stopped. I turned and he was gone. Just gone? But the laughter, it didn't stop. It was coming from behind us now. We all turned at once, and that's when I saw it. The figure, standing at the far end of the alley. But not just any figure. It was her, the one who had been cut down just moments ago, now standing tall, her face twisted into the same grotesque grin as the mask. Blood dripped from her side, her skin pale, eyes black as the void. The Night Stalker wasn't behind us anymore. He was inside her, and we were next. The sight of her standing there, her face twisted into that sickening grin, froze my blood. It wasn't possible. I'd seen her fall. I'd seen the blade cut deep into her side. I'd heard her scream. And yet there she was, alive but not alive, with that same hollow look in her eyes that the stalker had. The laughter still echoed in the alley, bouncing off the brick walls, surrounding us like a suffocating fog. It wasn't hers and it wasn't his. It was something else. Something far worse. The others had backed away, their breath ragged, eyes wide with disbelief. We were trapped between her, whatever she had become, and the narrow brick walls of the alley. I could feel the cold press of fear against my skin, as real as any touch, clawing at my throat, making it hard to breathe. There was no way out. She took a step forward, her movement jerky and unnatural, like her body was being controlled by invisible strings. A wet gurgle came from her throat, and blood, thick, dark blood, dripped down her side, soaking her torn shirt. "Stay back!" one of us shouted, their voice trembling, barely holding together. You're dead!" She didn't answer, didn't even acknowledge the words. She just took another step forward, her feet dragging along the pavement, scraping like nails across a chalkboard. And with every step, that laughter grew louder, more twisted, until it felt like it was coming from inside our heads. My legs felt like they were made of lead, heavy and immovable. I wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by the sheer wrongness of it all. This wasn't just death. This was something else. Something that twisted the very nature of reality. She raised her head, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Like the girl we had known was still in there, somewhere, fighting to get out. But then the mask of that grotesque grin slipped back into place, and whatever was left of her was swallowed by the darkness. Her hand moved, slow and deliberate, reaching into her jacket. My heart stopped as she pulled something out. It was the blade, his blade, the one the stalker had used to cut her down. Blood still clung to its edge, glistening under the flickering streetlight like a snake's scales. She gripped it tightly, her knuckles white, and then took another step forward. "We have to go," someone whispered, their voice barely audible over the sound of the laughter and the scraping blade. "Now!" But before anyone could move, she lunged. The blade sliced through the air with a sound that made my skin crawl, and before I even realized what was happening, it connected. The person next to me, one of the others, one of us, let out a strangled gasp as the blade drove deep into their stomach, blood gushing from the wound in a torrent of dark red. They fell to their knees, their hands clutching at the gaping hole, their eyes wide with shock and terror. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I could only watch as the life drained from them, their breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Then she laughed. It wasn't just the eerie echo of laughter that had surrounded us before. It was hers, her own voice, twisted and warped, bubbling up from her throat in a sound so wrong, so inhuman, that it sent a chill straight through me. But the worst part, the part that made my stomach twist in horror, the part that made me feel like I was losing my grip on reality, was the look in her eyes. They weren't empty anymore. They were alive with something that gleamed with malice, with hunger. She looked at us like we were nothing more than prey, and in that moment, I realized the truth. The Night Stalker wasn't just some masked killer, some figure of legend. He was something else. He wasn't just a person. He was a force, a presence, something that could move from body to body, consuming those it killed and turning them into it. He had taken her, and he could take any of us. The others bolted, scattering in different directions, desperate to escape the alley, desperate to get away from the horror that had just unfolded before our eyes. But I couldn't move. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind spinning as the pieces of the nightmare fell into place. The scraping sound started again, and I looked up just in time to see her, no, it, coming for me. The blade dragged along the pavement, leaving a trail of blood in its wake. The smile on her face, that twisted, grotesque grin, seemed to stretch wider, splitting her lips open until blood poured from the corners of her mouth. She raised the blade high, and I could feel the cold metal of death creeping closer, inch by inch, until it was almost too late. And then something snapped inside me. I turned and ran, faster than I'd ever run in my life, my feet pounding against the pavement, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear the scraping, the laughter following me, closing in with every step. I darted out of the alley, into the empty streets, my mind racing. I needed to get away. I needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere far from this nightmare. But there was no safe place. No matter where I ran, no matter how fast I moved, that scraping sound was always there, always right behind me. The Night Stalker, the thing that had taken her, was always right behind me. I rounded a corner and skidded to a stop. My heart dropped into my stomach. There, at the end of the street, standing under the flickering streetlight, was the figure, the mask, the twisted grin. But it wasn't her this time. It was me. I was standing there, grinning back at myself from the shadows, holding the bloodied blade in my hand, and in that moment I knew. He had already taken me too. The figure standing under the flickering streetlight stared back at me, its face twisted into a mask of horror. My face, the bloodied blade glistened in its hand, just like the one I'd seen moments before, and I felt the cold grip of panic tightening around my chest. The world spun around me, everything blurring together. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. But then something shifted. It wasn't the world that changed, it was me. I wasn't going to die like this. I wasn't going to let this thing, this monster, win. Somewhere deep inside, past the fear and the terror, a spark of defiance ignited. And I knew that I had to fight back. This wasn't how it ended. Not for me, not for any of us. The scraping sound stopped. I looked around, confused. The scraping sound stopped. I looked around, confused, the world suddenly still. The cold, oppressive air that had suffocated me moments ago seemed to lift, like a weight had been pulled from my chest. The twisted grin on the figure's face faltered for just a second, and I saw it. The faintest flicker of doubt in those cold, hollow eyes. I wasn't afraid anymore. "You're not real," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "You're just a nightmare, and I'm not letting you control me." The figure tilted its head, that grotesque smile stretching wider, but I stood my ground. I could feel the truth bubbling up inside me, like a dam had broken. This thing, it wasn't a person. It wasn't even a spirit. It was fear itself, something that thrived on our terror, feeding off the panic that it had spread throughout the town for years. It wasn't just about killing. It was about keeping us all trapped in that endless loop of dread, every Halloween, for as long as we let it. But fear only has power if you let it. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," I said, louder this time. The figure didn't move. Its empty eyes bore into mine, but I could see it now, clear as day, the truth behind the mask. It wasn't me standing there. It wasn't anyone. It was just an illusion, a trick of the darkness. And as I stood there, staring into its hollow eyes, I realized something else. I wasn't alone. I could hear footsteps behind me, soft and steady, and when I turned, I saw them, my friends, the ones who had run, the ones who I thought had been lost. They were all there, standing with me, eyes wide but no longer filled with terror. They had seen it too. They had felt the change in the air, the lifting of the weight that had hung over us like a cloud. We weren't alone in this, and together we could stop it. One by one, they stepped forward, standing beside me, facing the figure in the street. The creature's grin faltered again, and for the first time it seemed to shrink, its shape flickering like a dying flame. The scraping sound was gone. The laughter had faded. All that was left was us, and the fading remnant of what had once been the Night Stalker. "You're done," I said, my voice steady, calm. "You don't control us anymore." The figure took a step back, its form shimmering, like smoke being blown away by the wind. The streetlight flickered one last time, and then it was gone. Completely. The street was empty. The mask, the blade, the twisted grin, it had all vanished, as if it had never been there at all. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. The cold that had gripped the air melted away, replaced by a strange sense of peace. We were safe. We stood there for a long moment, letting it all sink in, the weight of what had just happened slowly washing away. The fear, the terror, the nightmare, it was over. We had faced it, and we had won. "You okay?" one of my friends asked, stepping closer, their voice shaky but hopeful. I nodded. a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "Yeah, I think I am." We didn't talk much after that. There wasn't much to say. The streets were quiet, empty, and for the first time in years, Halloween felt like just another night. No more legends, no more monsters lurking in the shadows, just us, standing together, stronger than we had been before. As we walked back toward town, the first hint of dawn began to break on the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over everything. The world felt different now, lighter, brighter, as if a curse had finally been lifted. We'd made it through the night, and for the first time in a long time we were free. The Night Stalker was gone, forever, and we knew, no matter what other horrors the world might throw our way, we could face them, together.